I will work for 1 meal a day, sir. Just give me a roof.
He was already looking at the photograph when she stepped off the train. Not at her. At the photograph, the small portrait she had sent 3 months ago, 2 weeks of mending wages, because she had wanted to look like someone a man could write back to. Thaddeus Vance looked at it, then looked up at her, and his face did the thing faces do when the number doesn't match the column. She was still 2 steps from the bottom of the stairs. "You look nothing like this," he said. "I sent that photograph myself. You did not describe yourself accurately in your correspondence." He said it like a line he had rehearsed. Loud enough. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight. One looked at the ground, the other held the careful neutral expression of a man trying not to be part of something he was already part of. Thaddeus Vance folded the photograph in half, then again, pocketed it, turned, and walked back down the platform. One of the men said something she couldn't hear and Vance laughed, short, relieved, the laugh of a man who has done an uncomfortable thing and come out the other side, and then they were gone. Abigail stood on the platform stairs with one hand on the railing. The train was pulling out behind her. A woman with 2 children had stopped walking. A man loading freight held his hands still on a crate. The station master stared at his ledger with a pen that wasn't moving. Nobody spoke. She had sold her mother's looking glass for this ticket. Her winter cloak. The good bedding. 3 days on a train in a dress she had let out at the seams herself, because she had wanted to arrive looking like someone worth arriving for. She took her hand off the railing, picked up her bag, and walked off the platform. She sat down on the bench outside the station, put her hands in her lap, and looked at the street. She did not look back. There was nothing on the platform anymore that belonged to her. She noticed the boy without meaning to. 8 years old, red-cheeked, coat half-buttoned against the cold, moving with the focused calm of a child committed to not being noticed. He stopped near the barrel by the trading post counter with his back to the room. His hand moved once, quick and practiced, and something disappeared inside his coat. He turned and found her watching him from the bench across the street. He went completely still. His eyes were wide and calculating, running through whether she was the kind of adult who called out or the kind who didn't. Abigail held his gaze for 1 moment. Then she looked down at her hands. When she looked up he was gone. 43 cents. 1 bag. 1 town where nobody knew her name, and half of them had just watched a man fold her photograph in half and walk away laughing. She picked up her bag and crossed the street. The sheriff came out of his office as she passed, looked at her, looked at the bag. "You need somewhere to be?" He held the door open, gave her coffee, pulled out the chair across from his desk, and listened without interrupting. When she finished he was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of a man running through what he had available. "I know a man," he said. "Widower. 4 children. Ranch 6 miles out. Been needing help since spring and hasn't done a thing about it. Why not? Stubborn and busy. And the kind of man who doesn't ask for things." He sent a boy up the street. Cole Mercer came through the door 20 minutes later with a flour sack over one shoulder and sawdust on his sleeve and the look of a man whose morning had just changed shape on him. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked back. The sheriff explained in 4 sentences. Cole set the flour sack against the wall and looked at her the way a practical man looks, taking the measure of what was in front of him and what it would require. "I have 4 children," he said. "Oldest is 15. Ranch is 6 miles and the road gets bad in winter." She had been doing the arithmetic since the platform. She looked at the doorway behind him. The boy was there, standing just outside with his coat still half-buttoned and both hands in his pockets, his eyes moving between his father and the woman at the desk. He met her eyes. She looked at Cole. "I will work for 1 meal a day," she said. "Just give me a roof." Cole looked at her for a long moment. She looked back straight, because looking away would cost her something she could not afford to lose. "Come on then," he said. He picked up her bag before she reached it and carried it out without asking. She climbed up onto the wagon herself. The boy pulled himself into the bed without being told and settled against the flour sack. He looked at her across the wagon bed, then reached into his coat. 4 crackers. Slightly crushed. He held them out. Not an offering exactly. The direct practical gesture of a boy who has assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion. She took one. He pulled his hand back and ate the rest in 2 bites and turned to look at the road. Cole clicked his tongue and the wagon moved out of Coldwater Creek. She did not look back. 6 miles. Mountains on both sides, cold coming off them steady and clean. The boy watched the trees go past with his chin on his arms. She looked at the road and did the new arithmetic. 1 meal a day. 4 children. A roof. A man who communicated in flour sacks and practical sentences. She had worked with less than this her whole life. The ranch came through the trees in the late afternoon light and she saw the kitchen window first. A girl moving behind the glass, quick and deliberate. Cole pulled the wagon to the kitchen door, and the door opened before he finished with the reins. Jo came out wiping her hands on her apron, flour on her sleeve, 15 years old, already reading the yard before she had fully cleared the threshold. She looked at her father, then at the woman on the wagon seat, then at the dress. The deep blue wool let out at the seams. The pressed lace at the collar, trail dusty now but still unmistakably, a wedding dress. Jo went completely still. Behind her the doorway filled, Silas at Jo's shoulder, and at the very edge of the frame pressed against the doorpost, Maggie. 4 years old. Watching with the total unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that matter. In the yard Toby stood beside the wagon looking at Abigail with those same calculating eyes from the ride, deciding something. Abigail understood what was moving through Jo's face before Jo understood it herself. She climbed down from the wagon before Cole had said a word, walked to the porch steps, and looked at Jo directly. "I am not your father's wife," she said. "I am nobody's wife. I am the help. I will sleep wherever there is space and I will not touch your mother's things." Jo looked at her, then at her father. "Her name is Abigail," Cole said. "She will help with the house." Something moved through Jo's face and settled into a decision that had no warmth in it but was not yet a closed door. She stepped aside. 1 step, just enough. Abigail picked up her own bag and carried it through the door. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and burned biscuits, and underneath both, the smell of a house that was still trying to remember how to be a home. She set her bag against the wall and stood in the middle of the kitchen in a dress made for a wedding that had lasted 40 seconds. She did not look at the cold stove or the low flour bin or the mending pile on the chair. She looked at Jo standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her chin up. Then she looked away. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook, sat down at the mending pile, picked up the first shirt, and began. Outside, Toby stood in the yard, still deciding whether giving away those crackers had been the right thing. Maggie had not moved from the doorframe. She was watching Abigail's hands, the needle going in and coming out, steady and even. She watched for a long time, then she came inside. She did not sit near Abigail, but she sat in the same room. Jo made breakfast before sunrise. Abigail knew this because she was already awake, lying on the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the stove catch and the cast iron pan set down with purpose. She did not go out. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose ground was to arrive in someone else's space before they were ready for you. She waited until she heard the children coming down, the heavier step of Silas first, then the 2 lighter ones, and finally the sound of small feet on stairs still too tall for them. Then she got up, dressed, folded her blanket, and went out. Jo was at the stove with her back to the room. Porridge on. Biscuits in the pan. She did not look up when Abigail came through the door. She did not say good morning. Abigail did not say good morning either. She stood inside the doorway and looked at the kitchen the way she looked at every kitchen she had ever worked in, taking the measure of where the effort was going. The flour bin was lower than it should be for a household this size. The salt pork had been cut into portions smaller than it needed to be. The biscuits in the pan were the right number for 4 children and 1 man. She looked at that for a moment. Then she went to the mending she had left unfinished the night before, sat down, and picked up where she had stopped. Not 5 children and 1 man and 1 extra woman. She had not been counted. Where is the mending basket kept? Joe turned from the stove. It was the first thing Abigail had said to her directly since the porch steps, and something moved through Joe's expression. A small recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when something doesn't go the way they expected. She nodded toward the shelf beside the window. A basket. Full. The kind of full that meant it had been added to regularly and emptied infrequently. Is there a system, Abigail said, for which gets done first? Papa's work shirts, Joe said. Then the children's. Then whatever else. All right, Abigail said, and went back to the shirt in her lap. Joe went back to the stove. The biscuits began to smell the way biscuits smell when they are almost ready, and then slightly past ready. Joe pulled them out, looked at them for half a second with her jaw set, done, and slightly dark at the edges, and put them on the table without comment. Silas came in first and ate without looking up from his plate, 13 years old and already carrying his father's quietness, the habit of a boy who had learned to save his words. Toby came in behind him, stopped in the doorway when he saw Abigail, looked at her with those same calculating eyes from the wagon, then sat and pulled the nearest biscuit toward him. He reached for another. Toby, Joe said. He took one more anyway, but more slowly. Maggie came down last, both feet on each step, holding the wall. She crossed the kitchen floor without looking at Abigail, climbed onto the bench beside Silas, and waited for her bowl. Joe set it in front of her. Maggie looked at it, looked at the biscuits, then looked at her father's empty chair at the head of the table. She ate. Cole came in from the barn at 7:30 with the cold still on his coat and mud on his boots. He looked at the table, at the children eating, at Abigail in the corner with the mending, then poured his own coffee, took a biscuit from the plate, and ate it standing at the counter the way a man eats when sitting down has become a thing he has stopped doing. He finished, put his cup in the basin, and went back outside. Toby watched the door close. Then he looked at Abigail. She was threading a new needle. He went back to his biscuit. The morning settled into its shape. Silas left for the far field behind his father. Toby disappeared. Maggie moved through the house in her orbit, kitchen to front room to porch and back, pausing sometimes in whatever doorway Abigail was working in, looking at her, then moving on. Never closer than the doorway. Abigail did not move toward her. She worked through the mending pile steadily, shirts, a pair of trousers with a torn knee, a child's dress with a pulled hem. Joe cleaned the kitchen, cleaning around Abigail's coat on the hook without acknowledging it was there. When the kitchen was done, she started the bread, working the dough with the force of a girl who had taught herself from memory, right motions, but fighting it instead of reading it, pressing down when it needed turning, pushing when it needed to rest. Abigail said nothing. The bread would be dense. It would still be bread. It would be Joe's bread, and that mattered more than whether it rose the way it should. At noon she set the mending aside and went to the larder. She looked at what was there, the dried beans pushed to the back, the half round of cornmeal, the cold box with the salt pork, 2 eggs, and a heel of yesterday's bread going hard. At the current rate, the portions at breakfast, the number of mouths, the size of the flour bin, they had perhaps 3 weeks before the larder began to show real strain. She could stretch that to 5. Maybe 6. She did not say this. She took what she needed for the midday meal, closed the larder, and started the stove. Joe appeared in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, watching Abigail move between the counter and the stove. Abigail did not tell her to leave. She did not ask her to help. She reached for the salt. "Second jar from the left," Joe said. "The right one's for baking." Abigail moved her hand to the second jar. "Thank you," she said. Joe said nothing, but she did not leave the doorway either. Supper was the first time all of them sat at the table together. Cole came in from the fields, washed at the basin, and pulled out his chair. Silas glanced up, then back down. Toby's fork stopped moving for half a second. Maggie shifted slightly on the bench toward the empty chair beside her, the one closest to her father, and her hand moved to pat the seat once before she went back to her food. Abigail set Cole's plate in front of him and went back to the stove. She ate after, standing at the counter, eating what remained in the pot slowly and without making anything of it. Joe looked at her plate, then at Abigail at the counter, then at her plate again. Her jaw moved once. She said nothing. She finished her supper, carried her bowl to the basin, and went upstairs, and the sound of her footsteps was the only sound left in the kitchen. That night Abigail sat on the edge of her cot in the small room off the kitchen. Her bag was on the floor beside her, still packed. She had taken out only what she needed, her work dress, her nightgown, her needle case. She had never been anywhere long enough to unpack fully. She did not unpack now. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the house settle, the creak of a floorboard above, the wind finding the gaps in the eaves, the low steady sound of the cold outside. Somewhere above her Maggie was sleeping. Somewhere above her Joe was not. She could tell the difference. She had learned a long time ago how to hear the difference between a house asleep and a house pretending. She sat until the pretending stopped. Then she lay down, closed her eyes, did the arithmetic for tomorrow, and fell asleep before she reached the end of it. The bread had been dense for months. Abigail could tell from the way the children ate it, dutiful rather than hungry. One morning, the loaf came out so hard the knife met resistance. Joe stood at the counter with the blade in her hand, her jaw set. Abigail did not look up from her mending. "The starter," she said. "Can I see it?" Joe paused, then opened the crock beside the stove and turned it so Abigail could see. It was gray at the top. Flat. The smell of it too sharp, too thin. "It needs feeding," Abigail said. "Twice a day for 3 days. Then it will work again." "I know how to feed a starter," Joe said. "I know you do," Abigail said, and went back to her needle. 3 days later, the bread rose the way it was supposed to. Joe pulled it from the oven and stood looking at the high, golden loaf. Something moved through her face, but she put it away before anyone could see. Abigail kept her back to the room at the wash basin. She said nothing about the bread. Toby broke a spoke on the small wagon wheel on a Tuesday. Abigail found him standing beside the wagon with his hands in his pockets, looking at the broken piece with the expression of a boy who knew how the next part went. "Your father's in the south field," she said. "Show me what you have in the tool shed." "It needs a new spoke," he said. "I know. Show me what you have." They worked for 2 hours. She knew more about the repair than she let him see, letting him find the solution slightly ahead of her, letting him fit the spoke into place and drive the pin while she held the wheel steady. When it was done, he stood back with his hands on his hips the way his father stood. "Don't tell Papa," he said. "Your father has enough on his mind," she said. Toby looked at her, and something shifted in his face, the first loosening of something that had been held tight since the wagon pulled into the yard. He picked up the tools and put them back where they belonged. Cole noticed things without appearing to notice them. He moved through the ranch seeing only what required action. A loose fence post, a low water trough, a child quiet in a way that meant something. He did not look closely at things that didn't require action. Abigail suspected he had learned that looking too closely at some things made them harder to get up from in the morning. But he noticed. The wood box outside her room was never empty. The stiff latch on her door was smooth one morning without explanation. A second lamp appeared on the kitchen shelf. She said nothing about any of it. Neither did he. It was Silas she watched most carefully. 13 years old, working like a man, saying almost nothing. Every evening when Cole came in from the fields, Silas was already at the table. Not eating. Just there. His eyes would go to his father's face the moment he cleared the door, one quick look, there and gone, and then he would drop his head and pick up his fork. She started having supper on the table the moment Cole's boots hit the porch. The evenings Silas came in to the smell of hot food, he sat differently. Looser. Like something he had been carrying since morning could finally be set down. 3 weeks after she arrived, Jo stopped making breakfast first. She came down one morning at the usual hour and Abigail was already at the stove, biscuits in, porridge on. Jo stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair unbraided, looking at the kitchen. Abigail did not look up from the pan. "Sit down," she said. "They'll be ready in 10 minutes. Jo sat. She placed her hands flat on the wood and looked at her mother's kitchen, the one she had been running since the spring before last, because someone had to and she was the oldest. She sat there in silence for 10 minutes while Abigail finished the biscuits, set the plate on the table, and poured the coffee. Then the children came down. Toby stopped in the doorway, looked at Jo sitting at the table with her hair down, looked at Abigail at the stove, filed this information away, and sat down. Maggie climbed onto the bench beside Jo, leaning against her arm. Jo put her hand on Maggie's back. She looked at the biscuits. She took one. That afternoon, Jo came into the kitchen and stood beside Abigail at the counter, watching her work the fat into the flour for the pastry crust. "Show me that," Jo said. "Put your hands in," Abigail said, without stopping. Jo put her hands in the bowl. "Not like that. Lighter," Abigail said. "You're not trying to mix it, you're trying to keep them separate as long as possible." Jo adjusted. Abigail guided her, making the same motion, slower. Jo watched, tried it, and got it almost right on the second attempt. Abigail said nothing about almost right. She simply moved to the next step. They worked side by side in the kitchen that had been Jo's for 14 months, talking about nothing except the pastry. It was the longest they had ever been in the same space without one of them moving to create distance. When they were done, Jo wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the bowl, and carried it to the cold box without speaking. Abigail started on the next thing. That evening after supper, Cole stayed at the table. Not like a man who had decided to stay, but like a man who had forgotten to leave, because the room felt less heavy than it usually did. The children drifted up to bed one by one, Toby last, pausing in the doorway to look at his father and then at Abigail before going up without a word. The kitchen went quiet. Cole turned his cup in his hands. Abigail washed the dishes, matching his silence. After a while, he said, "Jo ate breakfast sitting down this morning." She did not turn around. "Yes," she said. He turned his cup again. "She hasn't done that in a long time." Abigail set the last dish on the shelf and dried her hands. She said nothing. She did not need to. Cole sat at the table a while longer after she went to her room, the lamp burning low, the cold pressing steady against the windows. In her small room, Abigail sat on the edge of her cot with her hands in her lap. She thought about the pastry, and Jo's hands adjusting to the lighter pressure. She thought about Silas's shoulders dropping when his father reached for more bread. Small things. She had always worked in small things. And for the first time since arriving, the small room didn't feel quite so cold. She lay down and let the dark come in. The cold came down in the night. Not gradually, all at once, the way a door slams shut. By morning, the water in the barrel outside had gone solid, the kitchen windows were frosted on the inside, and the frozen earth rang hard underfoot. Abigail heard it happen from her cot, the wood contracting, the gaps in the eaves making a new sound under the weight of it. She got up before the house woke and went straight to the root cellar. She lifted the door, and the smell reached her first. She lowered her lamp into the dark. The potatoes had gone black at the edges. Enough of them to matter. The squash had split from the freeze, the flesh soft and pale with a particular look of something past saving. She stood there in the dark for a moment. Then she dropped the cellar door and went to the kitchen to light the stove. Cole found it an hour later. She heard him at the cellar, the door, the pause, the door again, and kept her hands moving at the counter. He came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway with the careful evenness of a man who has seen something he has not yet calculated the full size of. How bad? The potatoes are mostly gone. The squash too. What's left won't last the week. The road to town? For weeks. Maybe 5 if it holds like this. She nodded and kept her hands moving. "Come to the kitchen this evening, after the children are in bed." He looked at her, she did not look up and went back outside. The children felt the change in the air without being told. Children always did. By midday, Silas had come in from the field and split more wood than the day required. He carried 4 loads to the house and 2 to the barn, the axe coming down with the focused force of a boy doing the one thing he knew how to do when the situation was larger than his words for it. Toby disappeared after breakfast, returning at noon with his pockets full of dried corn kernels from the back of the feed shed. A small reserve, but something, the instinct of a boy who had learned to look for what others overlooked. He put them on the kitchen counter without explanation and went back out. Abigail looked at the kernels, poured them into a jar, and set it on the shelf. Joe made lunch with less flour than she usually used. Abigail noticed the adjustment and said nothing about it. Maggie ate everything on her plate, looked at the pot on the stove, and did not ask for more. She was 4 years old and she did not ask for more. Abigail turned back to the counter so nobody would see her face. That evening, after the children were in bed, Cole came to the kitchen and sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him and went to the larder. She reached for the back of the bottom shelf, behind the flour sack everyone saw. She lifted a heavy cloth, showing him what was hidden. Crocks of rendered fat, sealed and tied. Jars of preserved wild greens gathered in October, dandelion, wood sorrel, lamb's quarters, things growing at the edges of the woods that nobody else had noticed. Dried apple skins pressed flat in paper. Cornmeal packed tight. Salt pork scraps collected from the cutting board for 6 weeks, packed in salt. Beneath the counter, she showed him the boxes. Dried breadcrumbs, pressed wild plums gathered from the south edge before the freeze, and dried herbs. She stepped back. Cole looked at the shelves. He looked at the boxes, at all the small, saved things accumulating in the margins of their days, and said nothing for a long time. "When did you do this?" It was not quite a question. "Since I arrived," she said. "I did not know we would need it. I only knew we might." She sat down across from him. "It will last. If we are careful with the flour, use the stock to stretch the beans, and go through the salt pork slowly. For weeks, maybe 5. Until the road opens." She looked at him steadily. "I grew up with not enough, Cole. You learn to see what other people walk past." She said it plainly, not for sympathy, but because it was the accurate explanation, and he was a man who preferred accurate explanations. He picked up his coffee, looking at the lamp burning between them. "The children don't know how bad it was," he said. "No," she said. "Joe." "Joe knows," Abigail corrected softly. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The house held its warmth around them, the stove doing its steady work, the cold pressing at the windows without getting in. Cole set his cup down. He looked at her, not at the stores, but entirely at her, the way a man looks at a thing that has finally been understood. He nodded once, pushed back his chair, and went to bed. She sat at the table for a while after he was gone. Joe came down around 10, when the house had been quiet long enough that Abigail had begun to think about sleep. She heard the footsteps on the stairs, Joe's, she had learned them all by now. Joe stood in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her hair down, her arms not crossed for once. She looked at the open larder. Abigail had left it open without planning to, she had been looking at it herself. Joe crossed the kitchen slowly, standing in front of the shelves to study what was there. The crocks, jars, and pressed fruit. Abigail watched her face from across the room. She saw the realization hit. Joe's eyes moved across the shelves, the calculation running backward, from the full jars to the weeks of early mornings, from the crocks of fat to the cutting board, from the dried greens to the edges of the property at dusk. All the way back to the woman who ate last at every meal, took the smallest portion, and had never once asked for anything beyond what she was given. 1 meal a day. Joe's face changed. It was the small, quiet shift that happens when a calculation you have been working with the wrong numbers finally resolves. She stood in front of the shelves for a long time. Then she walked back through the kitchen and up the stairs, and her door closed. Abigail sat at the table and waited. She heard it after a while. Quiet crying, not the grief she had heard through the thin walls before. This was different. This was the sound of a girl who had been running a household since she was 14, doing it right, and realizing it still hadn't been enough. Abigail got up, went to the hallway, and sat down on the floor outside Joe's door in the dark. She did not knock. She did not call out. She just sat with her back against the wall, her hands in her lap, waiting. The crying went on for a while, then stopped. The door opened. Joe stood in the doorway, looking down at her. Abigail looked up. Slowly, Joe sat down beside her against the wall, her nightgown around her feet and her hair loose. Her face wasn't arranged into its usual mask. No jaw set. No chin up. Just 15 years old, and tired in the way of a person who has been strong for far too long. They sat in the dark hallway without speaking. Then Joe said, "I thought if I did everything right, it wouldn't matter that she was gone." Abigail said nothing. "It didn't work," Joe said. "No," Abigail said. Somewhere down the hall, Cole was lying awake in the dark, doing the heavy arithmetic of the ranch and the children. "She would have known what to do," Joe said softly. "About the cellar. About all of it. She always knew." "You knew," Abigail said. "You've been holding it together for months." Joe was quiet. "I burned the bread." "You fed them," Abigail said. "Every morning. Before anyone else was up. You fed them." Joe looked at her in the dark, and her face loosened, the way a fist relaxes when it finally decides the holding is done. She leaned her head back, and after a moment, it tipped sideways, coming to rest against Abigail's shoulder. Abigail did not move. She sat in the dark hallway with Joe asleep against her shoulder, until she was certain the girl was truly sleeping. She got up carefully and touched Joe's shoulder and said her name quietly. Joe stirred. Abigail walked her down the hall to her room and left her at the door and went back to her own cot. For the first time, she didn't look for a way out. She lay down, pulled the blanket up, and closed her eyes. In the morning, Joe was at the stove before dawn. The biscuits did not burn. Winter passed the way hard winters pass, slowly at first and then all at once. The cold released its hold in late February, the snow pulling back from the roads and the mud rising through the frost. The road to town opened. The hidden stores Abigail built carried them through, with enough left over that when Cole drove the wagon to the trading post for the first time, he came back with flour, salt pork, and 2 pounds of sugar. He set them on the counter without comment. She put them away without comment. That was all that needed to be said about the winter. Things had shifted in the house. Silas had begun talking at supper, in the careful economy of a boy who chose his words deliberately. Toby appointed himself her assistant outside the kitchen, showing up one afternoon with 3 dried plum pits from the south trees for planting. She put them in a jar on the windowsill where the light was good. And Maggie had stopped treating her like a stranger. One morning, the 4-year-old climbed onto the stool beside Abigail at the counter, watching in silence. Abigail placed a small piece of dough in front of her without explanation. By February, Maggie was on that stool every morning, standing there with the settled certainty of a child who had decided where she belonged. Joe still made breakfast, but the urgency was gone. She asked practical, specific questions, learning from the woman across from her. The letter came on a Thursday. Cole brought it from town, set it on the table, and went back outside. The railroad pushing through the next valley was hiring a head matron for the new hotel dining room. Guaranteed wages. A room of her own. More money than she had seen in years. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to her mending. The children found out by morning, through the walls, or the particular way adults breathe when they are being careful. Toby found her in the yard. "Are you going?" "I have not decided," she said. He looked at her with those calculating eyes. "Maggie's been calling you something," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets. "She won't say it out loud yet, but I heard her. When she thinks nobody's listening. Just so you know." Abigail stood in the yard, looking at the kitchen window. Maggie was on her stool, her small hands in the bread dough, working it with focused gravity. Joe said nothing for 4 days. On the 4th morning, she came to the kitchen garden where Abigail was turning the first soil of spring. Joe stopped at the edge of the dirt, holding a book, worn through at the spine, held together with cotton twine. "Mama kept this in the kitchen," Joe said, her voice level with effort. "Her recipes. Her mother's before that. I never let anyone touch it." The garden was quiet. Maggie watched from the porch. Silas stood at the fence line. Joe met her eyes. "If you're leaving, take it. So it goes somewhere it will be used." Abigail looked at the book, then at Joe, 15 years old, jaw set, eyes bright, holding out her mother's most precious possession to a woman she had spent months trying to outlast. She stopped fighting because Abigail had never once left. Abigail stepped forward and took the book. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the shelf beside the stove where the morning light would find it. Where it belonged. She came back to the garden. "I am not leaving," she said. Joe looked at the book on the shelf. She nodded once, the way her father nodded when a thing was decided, and went inside. Cole came to her that evening while she was finishing the dishes. "I need to go to town tomorrow. For the spring supply order." "I know," she said. "I made a list." A heavy pause. "Come with me," he said. She turned. He was looking at the shelf where the recipe book sat, then at her. "Come with me," he said again. The wagon pulled into Coldwater Creek on a Friday morning, the town awake and moving. All 4 children had come. Abigail climbed down, stood on the boardwalk, and looked at the street. This was the street she had walked onto in October with 43 cents and a wedding dress, with nowhere to go. This was the town that had watched Thaddeus Vance walk away laughing. She went inside with Cole to settle the supply order. They were coming out when she saw him. Thaddeus Vance was crossing the street with 2 other men. He looked up and stopped. Maggie instantly pressed her hand against Abigail's skirt. Joe stepped to her other side, Silas and Toby moving up behind them. Cole stood beside her. Vance walked over. "Miss Brennan, you look well. I may have been hasty in my assessment. The position at..." "Mr. Vance." Cole's voice was quiet, final. "The lady is taken." Vance looked at Cole. He looked at the children, at Maggie's hand tightly gripping Abigail's skirt. He put his hat back on and walked away. Not one of them watched him go. A woman on the boardwalk had stopped walking. 2 men outside the feed store stood still, nobody moved. Cole turned to her. He waited until she met his eyes. "I have 4 children," he said. "The ranch is 6 miles out and the road gets bad in winter. You know all of that. I am not a man who says things well." "Yes. Stay," he said, "as my wife, if that is what you want." A heavy pause. "And I want you to take the largest biscuit at my table," he added, his voice rough. "From now on." Joe stood very still. Silas looked at the ground, and Maggie looked up, waiting for the answer. Abigail looked at this man who had picked up her bag without asking, left Wood outside her door without explaining, and said come on then in a sheriff's office when she had nothing. "Yes," she said. "That is what I want." Something moved through his face, a loosening of something held tight for a long time. He offered her his arm. She took it. Behind them, Toby whispered to Silas, "Does this mean she's staying forever?" "Yes," Silas said. "Good," Toby said. "Based on that, I told the dog he could come inside." Joe closed her eyes briefly. Maggie took Abigail's free hand without looking up, held it, and they kept walking. She had stepped off a train in October with 43 cents and a dress made for a wedding that lasted 40 seconds. She had offered to take 1 meal a day because she had learned that this was the correct amount of space to ask for in the world. She had not known then that a family was quietly, stubbornly making room for her. 1 cracker at a time. 1 piece of bread. 1 hand pressed against her skirt on a Friday morning. until the woman who had spent her whole life taking the smallest portions sat at a table that was finally hers and ate. Thank you for watching Ironwood Narratives.